Hi, Karen Alari here. Glad you could join me. We're going to be painting this colorful little autumn scene called Fall River. And this is class 1 of 4 classes. Here's the acrylic paint colors we'll be using. And here's a list of the brushes we'll be using as well. And I'll be painting on an 8 by 10 canvas. So gather up your materials and let's get started.
All right, we're going over brushes. So what we have is a brush that's about a 1/2 inch wide. This is called a bright brush because it has a square tip and fairly short bristles. So we've got, this is a number 6, but you'll find with all the different types of brands of brushes, you might have different, they might be different. So it's not necessarily going to be the same number, but you need something about a 1/2 inch wide for your biggest brush if you're working on an 8 by 10. Now, if you're working on something bigger, you want to have a bigger brush, a few bigger brushes. So there's one that's about a 1/2 inch and one that's a little smaller, maybe 3/8 of an inch, I don't know, and then maybe a 1/4 of an inch. And these are all just square edged, and they're synthetic, so they're quite firm. You don't want to use like watercolor brushes that are soft. You want to make sure your brushes are fairly firm so you can push the paint around. And then we have a round brush. This is, you can kind of comparatively see the size. It's not too small and not too huge. And finally, we have the liner brush, which is a long, thin brush. It's very soft and long and thin. All right, so those are the brushes, and we'll also be using a palette knife today too. So this is a lovely painting that we're going to work on today, and we're going to do a couple of things. First of all, we're going to take our canvas that we're using, and the first thing we're going to do is jump right in and start pushing some paint around, because I want to put our first layer. It's called toning the canvas. It's just going to give us a layer on the canvas to fill in all the white of the canvas and fill up the weave of the canvas a little bit, so it's an easier surface to paint on and doesn't absorb as much paint. So we're going to start by just taking our biggest brush, and you're going to, I got to change my water thing here so it's the right direction. Okay, taking our biggest brush, and it doesn't matter what color that we use to do this, because we're going to paint over it as time goes by. So go ahead, and I'm going to use my old paint, my mixed up old paint, but you can start with white paint. You'll need a good amount of it, and just scoop some over there with your brush. And then I'm going to add a little bit of Indian yellow to it. And we don't want a real dark color. You want a color that's not white, but we don't want it so dark that we can't sketch on top of it later with our pencil. So I'm just going to mix that together with my brush, just like I'm stirring my sugar into my coffee, And then we're going to just paint that on to the canvas. And it doesn't matter, I'm using dirty paint, so my color isn't going to look like your color, but it doesn't matter. We're just painting it on. And what you're going for is, we don't use a lot of water. When we paint with acrylics, we don't add a lot of extra water to the paint. We just paint with the paint as it comes from the tube. But in this first layer that we're putting down, you're going to want to really push that paint into the canvas, brush it back and forth, use firm pressure, and that way you'll get a thin layer. So you don't want this first layer to be thick, because we want it to dry quickly so we can move on. And that is the major benefit of acrylic paint, is that it dries quickly so we can move on. And I love that about acrylics. So just go ahead and brush over it and get a nice thin layer of that paint, but still actually covering up all that white. And as you brush back and forth like that, you kind of scrub that paint into the weave of the canvas, and kind of use the tip of your brush and really use some use some force to get that in there. And this isn't, you know, there's different times in the painting we'll use different kinds of brush strokes and different pressures on the brush, and so we don't always work this way with this kind of tension. It's just when we're starting out and we want to get this paint on there and we want to get it worked into the canvas. We want to scrub that right into the canvas, and that prepares it to be a better surface for us to paint from. And you'll see as it starts to dry and you look back up at the part you've already done, it can tend to kind of pull away from parts, and you have to go back in there and scrub it back down a little bit. You just, especially if you've handled the canvas with your hands, you could maybe got a little bit of oils onto the canvas, and then that will tend to resist the water-based paint a little bit at first. So we just keep working and scrub that right in to the canvas. And I like to go over the edge of my canvas a little bit. When I'm done with my canvases, I paint the edges black. That's just how I finish mine. So I want to be sure to go over the edge of the canvas a little bit, because there's sort of a rounded edge usually to canvases, and you want to go all the way over that rounded edge so you don't see it from the front. And it doesn't matter, like I say, I've got, here's some dirt, this is dirty paint, so another color mixed in there, but it doesn't matter at all, because we'll be painting over all of this as we go. And again, this is called toning the canvas. And in this particular method, we don't see it because we have added layers over the top. In some methods of painting, you leave some of this toning visible. But it does tend to, at least the first layers and your lighter layers, it tends to have an effect on the colors that we put down after it. So go ahead and finish that. Get that all painted in. Another thing for those of you that aren't used to working with acrylics, when you're not using your brush, you're going to keep it sitting in your water container. We can't just leave acrylic brushes out on the palette like that, like you might with watercolors or oils, because the paint will dry within that brush within a couple of minutes, and then you'll have a hard brush and you'll have lost another brush. So you just keep that brush sitting right in your water dish. And when you're rinsing your brush between colors, you're going to want to really scrub that brush against the bottom of your water container to get all the paint out of the brush. You can't just swish it real gently like you're stirring coffee. You have to get it down there and really press it against the bottom, because your goal is to get all of the paint out of this. This is called the ferrule right here, this metal part, and the paint will tend to get lodged right up in the edge there of the brush where it meets the metal, and you want to get that all out or your brush will get ruined too. So you just give it a good scrub in the water and it works out good. I have one of these kind of water containers, and this has already gotten opaque. You can't see it, but there's ridges on the bottom of this side of the water container so that I can scrub that paint against those ridges, scrub the brush and get the paint out. And then it's got one over here where you can leave brushes sitting in clean water. So those are kind of neat. They're really super cheap. You can buy them online for like a couple bucks, or I don't remember, $5 maybe. But I'm always looking for deals when it comes to art supplies for sure. So we're just going to set these aside and let them dry for a couple of minutes. And again, the beauty of acrylics is that they will dry in a couple of minutes, so we'll be able to move on. But first, we're going to grab some watercolor paper and our palette knife, and we're going to talk about color, my favorite subject in the world. We're going to talk about color and color mixing. This is what happens with acrylics. Is you can't mix up a whole bunch of paint in advance that you're going to use on your painting, because in the meantime, before you get to it, it'll dry. and you won't have it anymore. So as you paint with acrylics, you're constantly mixing your colors and remixing your colors. So it's just by doing it that you get used to how your colors work together and what color to work for. And I already mentioned that I always set my palette up in the same way with the colors in the same spots so that I don't have to think about that. My hand just automatically knows where to go to get a particular color. So it doesn't really matter how you set them up, but just that you set them up in the same way each time really will help you out. So some things you might notice about our palette: we have two yellows. One is darker than the other, and we have two reds, and one is darker than the other. And then we just have one blue, and we're only using one blue this time because that's all we need for this painting, and it simplifies things a little bit. But beyond being darker, these paints are also warmer and cooler. And we use that term in painting just to say if this red is a warmer red because it's just more towards the yellow, it's more towards the warm colors. And this is a cooler red, the alizarin crimson, because it's more towards the blue. It's just cooler. And that's really kind of intuitive. You kind of understand when something feels warmer or cooler. And that plays a big part in painting and in choosing colors, not only what color it is, but whether it's a warm version or a cool version of that color. So that's why that palette is chosen. So what we're going to do today, what you can see is not on here, is our secondary colors. We just have primary colors, right? Red, yellow, and blue are our primary colors. We don't have orange or green or purple. So those are colors that if we're using them in our painting, we're going to be mixing them with these colors that we're starting with. So the first thing I'm going to start with, and I want us to play with, is greens, because you might think to yourself, you know, there's a lot of greens in here and a lot of different colors of green, and that might seem a little bit intimidating, but it's just simply made from ultramarine blue or one of our yellows, and then we'll find out too that we use red as well when we mix greens, which might not be intuitive. So let's start out by taking some of your yellow with your palette knife, and let's just put a little smear of that yellow onto your paper. So what we're going to do is find out how these colors mix together and what it looks like. Because depending on which blue you use, which yellow you use, you're going to come up with different greens. You know, there's color theory, red and yellow and blue make green, but in reality, when you're working with pigments, they all have their own personalities, and we want to kind of get to know those personalities by just playing. This is just color play, I like to call it. We're just playing around with color. So this is our blue, our ultramarine blue. So put that on the other side. So you've got ultramarine blue and you've got hands of yellow. And if your colors look a little different than mine, I try to calibrate my camera so it gets as close as possible to real color, but that it's still going to be a little bit off depending on your monitor and the lighting in your room and the lighting. So that's why I like you to do this yourself, so you're actually seeing those colors as they're actually turning out versus just trying to watch me do it, because you don't learn anything, at least I don't learn anything by just watching. I learn it by doing. So we've got that red and that yellow. So let's take some yellow and put it here. So I always pull the paints out, take a little bit from my piles, and pull them into my mixing area when I'm mixing paints. So this is our hands of yellow. I know some of you are using CAD yellow, and that's fine. So take some of your yellow, and we're going to mix a little bit of blue in it. And the reason I use a palette knife is because, see, you can just take that palette knife and wipe it off like that, and then we've got a nice clean palette knife versus using a brush when we have to rinse it a lot. So grab a little bit of ultramarine blue, but only a little corner, just a little bit on your palette knife, and mix that in to your yellow. And when you're mixing using a palette knife, if you haven't done that, it's not like you're not mixing it with the tip like this. You're not going like this in circles. You're smushing it down with the flat of the back of the palette knife, picking it up, scraping it up, smushing it down, picking it up, smushing it down. So you're going to use that kind of a motion to mix your paint. Just scraping it up and smushing it. That's a technical painting term, scraping and smushing. So depending on how much blue you used, you're going to get some version of green by doing that, right? So let's put this, hopefully we just used a little bit of blue, so this green is going to lean more towards the yellow. So let's put that next to our yellow. And you can see that mixing color, it becomes a continuum. You go from one color to the next gradually. All right, and then after you do that, get a little more blue on your palette knife and mix that in. And you'll find as you paint more and you get more used to this, that this whole mixing process becomes really easy, but at first it feels very awkward. But don't worry, because it will become easier as you go. Oh, got some dry stuff in there. All right. But that's with a little more blue. So we went from a yellow green to a little, still a yellow green, but a little bit bluer. So you can see that you can already see that given these two colors of paint, these two pigments, we're going to stay probably in a kind of a yellowish green mode. But let's see, let's test that. Let's start this time with some blue and add just a little bit of yellow to it. And the first thing you'll see, which I always think is very interesting, is that even though yellow is an even lighter color than that blue, somehow when you mix that yellow in, you go to a darker color, which I just think is amazing. But these are the things you don't find out until you start playing with your colors and having fun with them. So a lot of times when I come in and I want to do some painting, but I don't really have a project I want to start on, or I'm not feeling inspired, but I want to keep practicing, I'll just do some of this color play, and I'll just grab a couple of my colors or 3 of my colors and mix them in all different ways to see what I can make, see what I can discover. And that's really the fun part, is the discovery part of working with painting. Because there's certain things you think are going to happen, but they don't always happen that way. All right, let's add a little more yellow to that darker green and see what that does. Little more yellow. See, so now we're moving towards that yellow-green, and you'll be able to see this better on because you're closer to it. It's hard to see those dark colors on the screen, but you'll be seeing them in real life. And you can see how this is a cool bluish green, and now as we add a little more yellow, let's add just a little more. We're going to be approaching the ones that started from the other side. So you get this whole gradation of color. Now if you add white to that, I'm just going to add white to this last color so you can see. If you start adding white to these colors, you're going to get also a whole different range of colors to work from. And the first thing that you're going to see as you mix that yourself there, and as you mixed in the white, you could see that white, not only did it make the color lighter, but it made the color more opaque, right? It's less transparent. Before you put the white in, it's pretty transparent up there. You can see the paper through it. But once you start adding white to a color, it gets more and more opaque. So it's going to get lighter and more opaque. And those are all things that you get used to when you're painting and you're searching for a color to work from. Okay, so we're going to do one more thing, and that is take some of, start with your yellow. Always when you're mixing colors, you want to start with your lighter color in a mixture and then add your dark to it. And that's just because it's always surprising how little of the dark you need. So you see how much yellow I have there and how much blue I'm adding to it. I'm just adding a little tiny bit of blue, or it's not a tiny, tiny bit, but it's probably 5 times as much yellow as I have blue. So that's why you always start with the light color, because if I'd started with the blue and then put the yellow in it, you'll end up adding a whole bunch of yellow to get to the color you want. And I'm just going for sort of a mid-tone green. So this is just sort of a mid-tone green in what we are working with our yellow and our blue that we're working together. It's like I would say that's like an avocado green. It's like straight out of the 70s, right? They're avocado green. But the yellow greens are great for landscapes. Almost, they just, if you're looking to do a natural looking landscape, most of the greens are kind of a yellow green. And most of the greens are also a bit neutralized. So that's what we're going to talk about now. So say I have this green and I want to neutralize it. I don't want it to be quite so bright or vivid. I want it to be softer. So the way you neutralize a color is got a little bit to do with color theory. So you guys all know the good old color wheel, right? We've got red, yellow, and blue as our primaries. And then we have our secondaries, purple, orange, and green. Now, if you want to neutralize a color, what you're going to do is use a little bit of the complementary color. And complementary colors are directly across the color wheel. Or the other way you can think about it is, if I'm using green, which is made of yellow and blue, the remaining primary color that I haven't used yet is red. So if I'm using orange, I'm going to neutralize with blue. If I'm using yellow, I'm going to neutralize with purple, and vice versa, of course. So it's the complementary color, or if that's hard to remember, it's the color that's not part of the mix you're using. So if we want to neutralize a green, let's take a little bit of our green over to the side here, and let's add just a touch of red. I mean, just a hint, just a little hint on your palette knife to that green. And that's something you don't necessarily think sometimes you think you have to add black or gray to get a color to be more neutral, but that's not what gives you interesting, lively colors. You really want to go with this complementary color thing. So that gives us, with just a touch of red, gives us something that's even sort of more avocado-y. And then I'm going to add white to that to see what color that brings me. Because the white will always make us more opaque, lighter in value, and it also cools the color off a little bit. But that's pretty subtle. All right, so we went from our mixed green. In fact, I'm going to put a little bit of white in our starting green so we can see what that color looks like too. All right, so you can see that we've got that mixed green. And then we're going to take some more of the green, and this time add a little more red. So maybe 2 little bits. you'll find that this red-green mixture, especially using ultramarine blue as the blue, it's gonna go neutral really fast. So let me see if I can get something that doesn't go too far into the red, and I don't think I've succeeded. I'm going to try to put some more green back in it. Trying to go in just little tiny increments into more neutral versions of the color. As I think it was Deb was talking about going into the muddy browns, right? When you're working with pouring paint. So, but that's the key, Deb, if you don't want muddy colors, when you're pouring, don't put complementary colors where they're going to interact with each other, because that's where the mud comes from. Okay, so there, see, that makes a really a lovely kind of a chocolatey brown, like milk chocolate brown, I would say, color, with just more red in it. Now I'm adding some white to that to see what color that makes. So, and another thing I want you to realize with this exercise is that it's just tiny little bits of different color, or of the different colors, that can make little tiny subtle shifts that make a really different color. So let's do it again with even more red. So again, it's a continuum. We can go from green on one side to red on the other side, and it's just going to go all these little steps in between. So here's one that's leaning more towards red, but it's not bright red, right? A lot of times you don't want a really bright red, but you want something that's reddish. So adding a little bit of green to it is a great way to neutralize it into one of these subtle little colors. Is anybody seeing anything that they are surprised about with mixing these colors that they didn't expect you would get? It's like this last one is almost a flesh color, and it's made with red and green. Kind of interesting, huh? I'll do one last one that just has a tiny bit of green in it. See if I have a tiny bit of green left. And the red is, in fact, let me put some of this red over here so we see the pure red. Red's a pretty strong color, so it does tend to take over in a mix. And those are the kind of things that you just learn by practicing, playing. It's not practicing, it's just playing with these colors. But you can see if you just add a tiny bit of green, it goes from that really sort of cherry kind of a color into a much more subtle version. And then adding white to that. So many fun colors to work with. And that's even just using, if we did this again, and I'm going to suggest that you might want to do this again during this week, is do this process with your red and your yellow, but instead of using your naphtha red, use your alizarin crimson to do these mixes, and you'll see a whole different set of colors that come out of that. All kinds of different subtle colors and coming out. If you want to, you can put little initials up here. So this could be Hansa yellow, so I'd write HW, and this is ultramarine blue, so I write UB, and then I know those are the colors I mixed to do that. This is UB plus Hansa yellow, and over here is naphtha red, which is NR. And then I can refer back to that when I'm trying to remember. But the best way to do it is just try it. Just get that brush wet and give it a try and see what you got going on. All right, well, that was fun. All right, let's put that little exercise to the side and bring back our painting, which should be almost dry to the touch. Mine's pretty much dry to the touch. It's just a little bit tacky. Depends on how much humidity you've got and what's going on in your day and how hot it is. But all right, so the next step in our painting after we do our toning of our canvas, our next step is that we start thinking about how we're going to transfer this image onto our canvas. And that really depends on the type of image you're working from. If you're working with something simple, fairly simple like this, it's just got a few big shapes. It's got a shadow shape here, and it's got some light shapes back here. It's got a few land masses that we want to indicate, but there's not a lot of detail. I'm not trying to do a portrait or get a building just right and in the right perspective. It's fairly free flowing, and that's more fun, just to work with something free flowing like that. So we don't need to be really careful with our drawing. There's lots of ways that we can do a more careful drawing. In this case, our reference image is the same size as our canvas, so I could technically just put some transfer paper or rub pencil on the back of this image and turn it over, and then I could just trace over the main images, the main parts, to get them in the right place that way. Or we could make a grid and put grid lines on our paper and grid lines on our canvas, especially if you're trying to go up a size and you've got something that you really want to keep the proportions right. I like to use grid lines and grid it up like that. But we're not going to do that in this image. We've done that in some of our other classes, but this one is simple enough that we really don't need to do that. We're just going to use a pencil, and we're going to use comparisons or relationships to find our drawing. And I'm saying drawing, but really what I mean is roadmap. We're not drawing this. We're not trying to get the specific parts of these things down. We're just giving ourselves a roadmap, so we get these shapes, we get the things that we're trying to do in a particular place on the canvas. So we're going to do our roadmap, and we're going to do that by thinking about things like this. Okay, so first of all, we've got this. You look for something that's really obvious. So this landmass back here, this shoreline of the river, I'm going to look at the edge of my canvas, and I'm going to judge how far down this is or how far up it is. If I can, this is about halfway down my canvas, then I see that this shoreline is just a little bit below halfway. So I'm going to come to my canvas, I'm going to look at halfway, I'm going to come down just a little bit below it, and I'm going to draw my pencil line. Don't worry about it, because the pencil gets completely covered up with the paint, so you don't have to worry about that. But if you do make a big mistake, you can also just erase it. Acrylics are just really tough that way. You can just erase it with an eraser. So we've got a line that goes that far, and then I'm going to look at this landmass, this shoreline, sorry, and I'm going to look at the edge of my canvas, and I'm going to see that, this is about a quarter. I'd say it's about a quarter of the way up the canvas. So if this is half, this is a quarter. So this landmass is starting about here. So it's all relationships, relationships and angles. And then I'm going to say, okay, how far over did this go? Well, the land stops about right here. And if this is my center, it looks like this is about a third of the way over. So I'm going to go about a third of the way over, and I'm going to have this landmass stop right there, this shoreline. It's going to stop right there at about a third. Okay. So it's all just comparing. So, okay, we've got this landmass, this shoreline. How does this area here, this is our shadow area of our trees and bushes and whatnot. That's one big shape, and that follows down here, and this whole area is one big shape. So I can see it starts up here, almost at the edge of the, just a little bit off the edge of that canvas up there, and then it comes down to here, and look at that, the edge of that bush is right about half. It's right about half in my canvas. So here's where the edge of that bush stops. And then I just look at that shape, and I can see that this comes down a little bit. This tree goes up. Notice how far this is from the canvas right there, the edge of the canvas. So we're going to make sure we're down about that far. When we come out a little bit with this tree, it comes back in a little bit. It's not super critical exactly where, but we're just starting to get our eye tuned into the shapes that are being formed. And then this comes over here like this. This is the shadow in the water, the reflection in the water. So it comes down kind of like that. So you're just making a big shape with your pencil. And you're following where you are from your reference photo. Big, simple. The first thing that we have to do when we start to paint an image is get rid of the details in our mind, because the way that our minds work, and we look at an image, we immediately look at the details. We look at all the fine work and the individual things, and in order to paint an image, the first thing you have to do is squint your eyes, which helps get rid of details, or soften the focus of your eyes. I can just kind of blur out my eyes, and you have to start looking at it that way, so you're seeing the big shapes. You're no longer looking at the details. So, and that's just super important, and it's kind of hard to get your brain to work that way when it hasn't worked that way before. And don't feel frustrated about that, because that's just the human nature as well. All right, so we've got this big shape here. Now we want to place where our big elements are in the back. First off, we've got this big brightly lit tree, and this area right here is what we call our focal point, or our center of interest. And it is that way because it's got the brightest color, it's got the most detail, and it's got the most contrast. So we want to place that center of interest. So I'm going to look at the tip of my tree, and it's about halfway over here, the tip of it is. So it's coming in about here, and I can see how far down it is from the top of the canvas. So it's somewhere in there. Again, it doesn't have to be exact. We're just giving ourselves a road map. And it kind of has a triangular shape a little bit like that. And it comes down here, and there's some little bushes down here. That goes across like that. So that's kind of our first big tree, right? All right, so we got that big tree, and you notice there's another tree behind it. And if you look at this space between this tree and that at the edge of the canvas, so we've already got this tree established. The edge of this one comes about halfway. So the edge of this tree is over about halfway between that space. And it comes up a little bit taller, and it comes down. And it's all about, it's not exact. This isn't rocket science or brain surgery. It's all ishy. I love that about painting. And this one comes over. It's got another bush that comes up here. There's all these bushes down below. somewhere in there. And our last one over here is this tree on the edge comes right up and off the edge. It comes over like this, and then it comes down at an angle, comes in here, something like that. And again, we'll mess with these later, and then there's a little one behind it, right? We got this little, just this little bloop, a little bloop back there. Got little bloops here. These trees in the back are just, those are going to be little bloops in the back. There, there, there. You got all that stuff going on there.
Okay.
So we've got one more landmass down here, right? So shoreline thing, we've got it coming over again almost to half. So I used a lot of halves with this one. So about over to here, and you can see how far down that comes. It's just right on the edge of the canvas there, just maybe an inch up. And it comes up into a rock. Well, let's just do the dirt part first. We'll do the rocks second. So here we've got just this little shoreline that comes out like that and comes back, right? Just got a little bit of shoreline. It comes over about to the middle, maybe a little shorter than the middle. So if this is the middle, it comes somewhere in there. It doesn't have to be exact. And then it just comes up a little bit and goes over. And then over on the edge of it, we've got some rocks forming. So here comes a rock, and then here comes another little rock, and we're just doing the very outline, just the outline. That's all we're worrying about at this point. We're going to place a rock here. We'll paint over these and we'll paint around them. A lot of this at this point is just to get our minds thinking about what are we going to put in, what's going to be in our painting. Let's start diving into what's going to go on here. So that's all we need to do right now, is just get those big roadmap shapes in there. All right, okay, that's our roadmap. Step 2 done. Step 1, toning the canvas. Step 2, roadmap. Step 3 is the block-in. And the block-in serves a really important purpose. When we do the block-in, like I was talking about how what we're trying to do is not think about the details at this point. We're trying to get every idea of detail out of our head, and instead we're trying to see the big shapes of values, okay? Values are where everything lies on a continuum from white to black, light to dark. So, you know, there's light pink all the way over to dark red. You know, all the colors can come in every different value. So what we're trying to do in the block-in is establish our values. That's the most important step. The drawing stage was to establish our proportions and our big placement, where things are on the canvas. And now what we're going to focus on is what value is everything in. And this is probably the hardest thing for painters to really click in. I know it took me a lot of years to understand. People were always talking about values and what the heck. But it's really just training your mind to, instead of seeing this as just a bunch of greens and oranges, seeing this area here as darker. You see how everything here is in shadow? It's all darker in this area. So if you look at a painting from across the room, what captures you is its values. And if you look at a painting from across the room and it just looks boring and you walk on to the next painting, it's because they didn't get their value structure interesting enough. So that's why we focus so much on values, one reason. The second reason is it's values that help us give three-dimensional form to something. So everything is going to have light, medium, and dark, right? And that's what I can draw a circle on the paper and just color it in one color, and that's going to look very, very flat. But if I add a dark side and a light side to it, all of a sudden it's going to get 3 dimensions. So that's what we have to keep in mind, is that we're going to have dark, medium, and light within each area. So there's dark, medium, and light within our shadow area, but everything there is darker than anything that is in the sunlight. So the darks and the mediums and the light, the range changes depending on if you're in sunlight or in shadow. So that's what we're really going to think about. We're going to think about color, and we're going to mix up some colors, but we're just going to be ballparking the colors. But we're going to really try to nail the values of each area, and we're going to try to keep these areas pretty big. So first thing let's do is we're going to stick with our big brush like we used before, our big number 6, mine's a number 6 brush. And we're going to mix up some dark green. We already know how to do that, right? That's going to be our blue and our yellow. Start with the yellow. Don't do like I just did. Because see what happens when I start with the blue? I have a very, very dark colors. And then you need to add. But in this case, we're going for dark colors, so it's all right. So blue and yellow, right? Mix up a dark green and test that on your canvas. The second thing that you always want to do is always don't try to decide if you've got the right color by looking at your palette. Always test it on your canvas, because you're going to be comparing it to other colors that are already there. So I'm just looking at my reference image, and you see how we've got, I'm just going to go for some big shapes. So we're going to put some dark orange shapes here and here. And the rest of this we're just going to fill in a dark green. So I'm just going to fill that in. I'm not being careful with the brush strokes. I'm going over the lines. It's not, oops, I meant to put orange up there. So see, that's okay. We'll just go over it with the orange. So I'm just looking at where the green is, and I'm kind of just slopping that paint in. And you may have to mix up a little bit more like I just did, because I didn't have enough. But that's okay. You see how quickly you can mix the paint. You don't have to be really careful with it. You just kind of grab that paint, mix it together, and go. And I'm not being super careful to completely cover every single part like we did with the toning of the canvas. I'm just getting some color in there. And what you'll find with acrylics as you use them is that you end up using a lot more paint than you would think. It takes a lot of paint. And it's important that you let yourself do that. When you're mixing the colors, mix yourself an ample amount of paint. Don't be stingy with the color, or you'll end up with this really thin, non-covering kind of a thing. You notice how I went all the way down. I'm not stopping at that shoreline, because this whole area that's reflected is also part of this same shadow area of the painting. It's all one big connected shape. That's the way you want to start seeing your shapes, as big connected shapes. So I'm just being real messy. You can see how messy that is. I've left a little hole because we're going to put some dark orange here. We're going to put some dark orange up there. But it's just super messy and just slopped on there. Just getting your hand to learn to not be precious about it is another real step in painting. You want to get your hand to be loose and free with its brush strokes. So we're just doing that, just slopping that paint in there. The block-in is called the ugly stage. So Don't be worrying about this looking funny, because that's the way it looks. Of course, this is when your kid or your husband walks in the room and says, "Oh yeah, nice painting, honey." That's okay. For you, I know I say that joke every time. I apologize to people that have taken the class before. Okay, green, right? So let's do some dark orange. So the next thing we're going to do is grab some of your alizarin crimson and some of your Indian yellow. So this is a red and a yellow, right? But it's a dark version of red and yellow. You'll, like with always with red, you're going to use more yellow than you do red. But this gives us a lovely kind of a dark orangish color, and it doesn't matter if yours is a slightly different color. It really doesn't matter. The key here is to get this dark value. So we're going to get this dark value in here. And something that you're going to find is these colors are fairly transparent. So you see how I put that color on and you can still see the yellow through that because it's fairly transparent. That's okay. We'll come back and do another layer. That's how you build up nice rich color by doing that. All right, the next really obvious bright thing we've got for our block in is getting a nice bright color for this tree. And we want it to be very vivid in color. So we're not going to use a lot of white, because when you add white, you're also making the color more pastel. And we don't want to do that. So what I'm going to do is take a mixture of Hansa yellow and Indian yellow for this first layer. And I'm going to fill in that tree with this bright combination of Hansa yellow and Indian yellow. And the thing you look for when you're doing the block in, remember to go over those lines. Don't be really fussy and go exactly to the lines. So you don't want to create ridges or anything. But what you're looking for is when you squint your eyes and you look at your reference, you want to get that same contrast between dark and light, as you can see there. So that's what we're going for. We're looking for that contrast as those two places come together. And this whole painting is about reflections. So I'm going to take that same color, and below in the water, I'm just going to fill that in with that same yellow. So we're thinking about that as we're painting it, that whatever is up above is going to be reflected down below into the water. So I'm just going to scrub that in there. So we just take it incrementally. It's a good way to not feel like you have to remember everything at once when you're painting, but you just can focus on one concept at a time. And in this one, we're focusing on values. And if your color isn't quite the same, that doesn't matter, as long as you get the value right. Always rinsing your brush real good in between. Okay, well, let's do something. Let's go establish now our next lightest thing, which is going to be our sky. And I've chosen a real gray sky in this one because it's just kind of a fall day, and also because that real gray color is going to be a nice complement to the more bright colors in the landscape. So how in the world do I make gray, right? So it's pretty simple in theory. If you take red, yellow, and blue and you mix them together, you'll get gray or black. But that's the theory, and it doesn't actually work in pigment because it depends on which red and which yellow and which blue you're mixing together. So let's take alizarin crimson. Let's take some of that. And then let's take maybe twice as much of ultramarine blue. And then about the same amount that you did of the alizarin crimson in, not Hansa, in Indian yellow. Okay, so I've just chosen all my darkest colors to make a dark, dark. And depending again on what combinations and how much of the color you're using, that color is going to lean towards red, it might lean towards purple, it might lean towards brown. It's just going to depend, and in this case it's not super critical. And if you want to know, because that's going to come up super dark, see how dark that is? If I put it even against our darkest area, that's super dark. So if I put a little white in it, you can see what color you got going on. And this one's leaning a little bit towards purple, which I tend to lean my grays toward purple. It's just a personal preference. Okay, so what we're doing once you get something like that is make sure you got enough white in that to get a light version of that color and put that in your sky. And this will be a start because for those of you that aren't used to working with acrylics, they dry darker, especially in the lighter tones. They are going to dry darker. So if it looks too light, it's just about right. And the way we work around that is we just do layers. So we'll let that sky dry for a while, and it may be too dark, and we'll just see as it dries. And you notice I'm not too worried about the color. My color is actually kind of purple. From the screen it looks like it's a little bit pinkish, but it's okay. It doesn't matter as long as the value is right. And I'm looking at the comparison between the value here and here. And you can see how much that jumps. And I want to make sure I've got that same jump in value in here. We can always add more white later. It's almost always you end up having to lighten things up as they dry, but that's just something we get used to. So when you look at the value of this sky, it's about the same as the value that we used for the shoreline, at least these shorelines that are in sunlight. The color down here is a little bit more yellow, right? So I'm just going to take a little bit of Indian yellow and add it to that gray color that we just used for the sky. Till it starts looking a little bit more yellow, and you may have to add some more white, depending on how much of it you had left. Just so we can see where these shorelines are. Mine's still pretty gray. It just got even grayer because since it was already purple, as I added yellow, I got even a more neutral gray. So I'm just going to go past that by adding more yellow till I get something that's a little bit warmer. Color doesn't really matter though. I'm just going to put that in there. I'm going to put it over here. Every place where we've got this this shoreline and my rocks, I'm just going to all fill in with this particular value. And right here, my shoreline in sunlight. We're going to stop there because our shoreline as it goes into the shadow here is going to change in value. But out here, it's going to be that same lighter value. So see, we're thinking big shapes and we're thinking values. Not worried about anything else right now. And if you still got some of your dark here, if I take my brush that already has that lighter color on and I mix it in there, I can come in with a darker version of that. So just add some more of your dark to that color you just made, so that over here in the shadow, this is darker than this. This is lighter and this is darker. Whenever anything shifts from light to shadow, it's going to go darker. I think I'm going to go even a little bit darker than that. There we go. But that's okay. What we do is we get pretty darn close, and then when we get done with our first pass, we can stop and take a look at it and adjust our values again. And we spend time in this values part of the painting because it's important, and it also sets up, it makes it easy for the finishing touches. You don't have to be thinking about this anymore. All we'll be doing is thinking about honing in on our color and our brush strokes in the final part. We'll have everything else already figured out and established so we can't get lost. All right, let's do some of these greens back here. We got a bunch of green trees that are lighter in value. They got some shadow side on them, but we're going to focus right now on the light value. So we've got some lighter yellow greens, and as they move into the distance, they get a little bluer. You know, anything that you're working with in a landscape is going to get lighter and bluer and more neutral as it moves into the distance. So let's start with these yellow greens. So if I'm going to take my yellow, I'm going to add some blue to it, right, so that I don't use too much blue. But we need a good amount of paint. Be sure and mix up a good amount of paint. So these brightest yellows we're going to see down here. Let's put a little bit of that just down here in these bushes in the very front. We're just going to fill those in there. And when we're doing above, we're doing below. So whatever we're doing up there, we're just going to put some of that color down here. That's just yellow and blue, no white added to it. We're just seeing how bright that's going to be. Fill that in down there. Some yellow and blue. We're thinking about getting our brain understanding this image, understanding that those reflections, we're always going to think about putting them in above and below. But we're still just thinking big cutout shapes like you cut them out of construction paper. So once you get that, that's just yellow and blue, okay? But now we want to go back to this tree back here, and we think about, when we want to shift, we think about how is it different? It's lighter, so the first thing I'm going to do is add some white, because that tree is lighter. So I'm taking that same pile of yellow and blue I mixed up, and if you don't have enough paint, just mix up a little more. And I'm going to add some white to it to make it lighter. And you're going to push a little bit lighter than you think it's supposed to be. Now when I look at that, I'm like, okay, I'm lighter. That's pretty close to how light I want to be, but that's a really bright green. And this is a much more subtle green. It's bluer, isn't it? So let's add some blue to that. And just add a tiny bit. It's the corner of the brush technique. Take a little bit on the corner of the brush and then tap it off on the palette. So you just have a little bit. You can always add more, but the biggest thing that's gonna kind of trip you up is adding too much of the color that you're trying to add to adjust your color. See how you can add more? I added more there. Okay, so now that went more blue and a little more neutral, but by adding that dark color, I also went darker again, right? So if it's too dark, I'm going to add some white, right? So you just go through those questions in your mind. How light is it? And then, are you pretty close to the right color? It's not going to be exact. We're not working in exact right now. So that's lighter, and it's a little bit bluer. And I'm putting that down below as well. Big shapes. It's just a series of questions. Is it lighter? Is it the right color? Do I need to shift the color? And that's, that little area of the painting has all kinds of different colors in it, but we're just looking for the sort of the big average color there. Comparisons. You can see how my value comparison here, you see this is where these two meet, is where you can get your comparison and see how much darker this is than that. You want to have that shift be obvious. All right. So back here, in these trees back here then, they're further in the distance, so they're going to be bluer again. So I'm just going to stay with that same pile of paint, but I'm going to add more blue to it. And that blue is going to push these back further into the distance. Now I'm going to test that. I'm going to go, when I compare that, it's pretty close, but these colors back there, they look more neutral. They don't look as bright and colorful as this. So how am I going to neutralize my green? Add red, right? Now I'm going to use my alizarin crimson because it's a cool red. And I do my technique of you get a little bit on the corner of the brush and you tap it off till there's just hardly any left. And then you can come back and add more if you need. But if you're running into trouble with color mixing, it's almost always going to be because you're grabbing too much of your adjusting color at one time. You can always add more. You can always go back anyway because it will be because you can always fix mistakes in acrylic. There's no issues there. I'm lightening it up a little bit because it got a little bit dark. So now I've got a green that's more neutral and cooler, just to put in those background trees. I think I'm going to put a little more blue. It actually got a little too light. See, I put my white in and I went too far the other way. So I'm going to put a little more blue in, but it's got a lot of paint on there, so that's going to be about all I can do for now. So it's cooler, more neutral than the green up here, right? It should be a little darker than that. If yours is a little darker, that's good. because one of the important parts of these background trees here is helping to set up the brightness of this tree by having these neutral greens that are darker so you get dark against light. So mine are a little bit too light, but I have so much paint on there that I gotta let that dry. Filling in our spots. We only have two orange trees left to fill in. So these orange trees, they're darker, right? A little more neutral and they're darker. This one's a little redder, but we're going to focus on that little bit darker concept here. We want them darker than this one. And they're orange. They're more orange. This one leans more towards yellow. So let's use our alizarin crimson and our Hansa yellow. We haven't done that combination yet. There's all kinds of different ways you can come at this. Let's see what that does. That's a nice color. A little more neutral, but you see how this is a little too dark. We're looking at this area, this sunlit area of this tree, and you can see how that's darker, and that's what I'm really focusing on is the value. So I'm gonna start by putting more yellow in it, because yellow is lighter, right? And then I'm also gonna put some white. Let's see if I can get, that looks about right. So it's not as dark as our shadow area. It's not as brightly colored as our yellow tree, so I'm going to see some nice contrast there between neutral and bright. And I'm going to fill that in down below. Fill in all these spaces. All right, you guys getting our brownish orangish tree there? All right, we've got that brown tree, and the one over to the side of it is just a little brighter. So let's just take our naphthol red, so our bright red, and put it in that same mix. Let's see how that'll look. It's a pretty color, but it's too dark. So I'm going to add a little bit of white to it. So lighten that up a little bit. Yeah, that's okay, but now it's looking more pink, so it needs more yellow. So I'm going to use my Hansa yellow we were using this time. So I'm playing. Again, it's this color play, because we know this isn't super critical. We're going to be coming back and doing these colors again. So it's not anything that I'm going to get real worried about, but I'm just playing and giving it a try. So I'm going to fill that in with a slightly redder version for a cut tree over here. Putting that down below as well, like that. So you want to kind of look at it. We know that we've got this shadow area that we weren't covering very well because of our light yellow underneath there. So I'm just going to come back with one more layer of this green and this red to darken those up. So the orange we used over here was just Hansa yellow, or not Indian yellow with our alizarin crimson, our two darks, right? Working in the dark area. So we're going to use darks. So I'm just going to do one more layer over that so that it gets a little bit darker and I can see those values real clearly. You can really see the difference between the red in sunlight and the red in shadow. Same thing with the green. That was just our ultramarine with Indian yellow in it, right? Our darker yellow. In the shadows, we're using our darker colors. I think that's what it was. It might have been our other yellow. It's okay. Either yellow works. This time I used Indian yellow. It was a little bit more of a blue-green. That's okay. So I'm not worried about the color. I'm focusing on the value. I'm not worried about anything, actually, but I'm focusing on the value. And I want to make sure I get a nice dark covering on this shadow area. So I'm going to look at that. Only other thing I'm really seeing is that I want this area of the shoreline in shadow to be darker than that. And I've got this dark red and this dark yellow mixed up right here, so I can just take these two colors and mix them together, right? And that will give me a darker version. It's browner, but I don't really care. I just want it to be darker over there so that it stays in shadow. So I'm trying to see if I can clearly see my shadow and my light, and I can. So one of the other really important aspects to this painting too is that we've got all this shadow over here, right? And it's dark, but we need a balance to that big shape because you can see in looking at this now how unbalanced that looks because all the dark is over there on the one side. It's just all dark over here. It's like tipping over. So what I have to do and what we have going on in the finished painting is we have these little dark areas over here, you see? And those little dark areas are small, but what they do is they help balance the image. Because that's what we're doing now. When we're looking at our image now, we're deciding whether the value pattern is pleasing. And right now it's not pleasing because it's so unbalanced to this one side. So I know that I'm going to have some dark right over here. Doesn't really matter what colors. This is some of our dark green. I'm going to have some dark green over here, just like we do in the painting. There's just a few spots that have dark. And that little bit of dark, you see how that balances out the painting visually better. You really have to kind of turn your brain off because this is not a pretty image right now. It's not pretty, but we're just trying to look at those big shapes and decide if they feel okay. And if not, what is it about the value structure that isn't helping us feel okay? It's also got a little bit of dark down here. So I can give myself a couple of dark spots just so that I see that how that balance is going to work. Now that's much more pleasing. It's much more peaceful to have that balance than to have it where you were just falling off over into the dark side, right? These are a little bit more advanced concepts, so don't worry about them at all if you're just starting out, but maybe for some of my more advanced students, it might help you, think a little bit about the whys behind choosing a particular composition. So we've got those few dark spots. So at this point, you should just have everything kind of covered and looking at what things aren't working right or what aren't exactly right.
I'm concentrating so hard.
Yeah, and that's easy to do. I wish I could figure out a way to make it more, keep us in that lighthearted side of the brain, keep us in that right side, that creative side of your brain, instead of going into the left side that wants everything to be perfect and wants to do it in order. We want to ignore that part of our brain and just
Yeah,
have fun with it. And it really is um, it really is it really is shifting the way you're thinking, and it's something that we're not used to doing. But the more that you paint, or the more you do art, or the more that you have fun with it, the more you shift into that creative side of your brain, and you'll really start actually feeling yourself thinking differently. And that thinking, that way of thinking, goes into the rest of your life, and you start using it in your day-to-day life, and it just has an amazing effect to just add more quality to your life. It
right.
just raises your quality of life. And I just think that's a big reason why I paint, is to get out of that judgmental, left brain, critical side of myself and into the side that knows how to play and have fun, right? They always say we are all creative. Children are all creative. If you walk up to a 4-year-old and ask them to draw a dog, they're just going to draw you a dog, and they're going to be proud as heck, and they're going to have a good time doing it. But you ask a 10-year-old to draw a dog, and they've already learned to be judgmental and to not have faith in their creativity, and they're not going to be able to do it, or they're just going to refuse to do it. So our goal is to get back to that child mind, to get back to that place of where we're just playing. We're like, I wish we could almost do this with finger painting, I thought that's an idea. Maybe I'll start doing the block ends with finger painting, right? That might be fun. But it that's the goal. So, and you can take that with you every day when you're taking a walk, or you're looking out the window, or you're driving down the street. And instead of thinking about all the things that are going wrong in the world, you can just look at that tree and try to really see what colors you're seeing in the shadow, or what colors are in the sunlight, and how do those compare, what values are there. It gives your brain a whole new thing to think about and a place to go. All right, well, guys, we had a lovely class. Thank you. All right. All right. Take care, everybody. We'll see you
Bye.
next week.
Okay, bye.